Okay, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about state-dependent functioning, trauma, and the classroom. I should say I'm not an expert on education by any means. I got interested in trauma in the course of my PhD research on long sentence male prisoners. And it wasn't something that was originally on my radar at all. But it was once I started speaking to the men, I interviewed 12 men in prison nearing release, that their trauma narratives came kind of bursting forth. And it was something that I thought, you know what? I haven't read enough about the impact of this type of thing on human functioning and behavior. So I then did a lot of trauma trainings, including with some of the people that I'll reference in this, this talk today. But just the first slide, I suppose, here, I saw it on Twitter. It was about Maslow before Bloom, and that basically children in our classrooms can be dragging a lot of heavy baggage with them. Some of it is invisible, you know, some of it might be to do with the fact that they're very hungry, or that they have some kind of illness, or their parents might have an illness that has an impact on them. We know the impact of homelessness and the fact that many children and families are in unsuitable accommodation for extended periods, and this causes stress to them and their caregivers, and I believe has an impact on their capacity to learn and to behave well in the classroom. Polyvagal theory sounds horrendous, but basically it is a science of health, growth and restoration. We all have a vagus nerve, regardless of our religious beliefs, education level, or political affiliation or race. And the vagus nerve links our gut to our heart and lungs, and our ears and our face and our brain stem. And it is very implicated in our feelings of safety or threat in the world. So a key concept from Stephen Porges, who developed polyvagal theory, is about neuroception. And neuroception is the unconscious detection of safety or threat in our environment. And he says that our bodies need to feel safe in the presence of other bodies. So what that means for little kids, I suppose, is if they grow up with love and affection, they're caressed, they're cherished, and they feel safe with their primary caregiver, they're likely to feel safe with other people as well. They're likely to have a sense of trust, and they can go into a classroom, be curious, be open to learning, be open to making new friends. Whereas if they grow up in an unsafe home without affection, without their basic needs being met, their bodies will be unconsciously attuned to threat. And so we might presume that our classrooms are safe, but actually they may not feel safe to children who walk into them. So we shouldn't presume anything. There will definitely be children in classrooms who do not feel safe. And this has implications for their ability to learn, because our brains develop from the bottom up. The brainstem is the kind of primitive survival brain. And when children are exposed to a lot of stress and trauma, that part of their brain is overdeveloped at the expense of their attachment brain, which is about developing relationships. And then their cortical thinking brain, which is all about the capacity to process language, to learn new things, to plan for the future, to inhibit impulses. So there's a little link there to the Triune Brain video. If we had more time, I'd show it, but I highly recommend that you check it out in your own time. If you just Google it, it's little kids talking about neurodevelopment, and it's beautiful. My favorite definition of trauma actually comes from Gabor Mate, and he says that trauma is not what happens to us, but what we hold inside in the absence of an empathetic witness. So it's an embodied experience. It lodges in our tissues, in our skin, our neuroendocrine system. Everything basically can be impacted by trauma. And many of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with the pair of aces graphic of the tree, which situates family and individual adversities in the wider context of systemic and structural inequities. So things like poverty, discrimination, lack of social mobility, poor housing, and community violence are all very relevant as well to whether a child feels safe in the world or not. And then Karen Traceman's graphic about various other types of trauma is also very relevant, because many of us don't know, I suspect, that what happens to us in the womb can also impact our ability to function in the world. So if our mother has a very stressed pregnancy, that might have negative implications for us. If we're refugee children or in the asylum process, living in direct provision, all of that can also have an impact on our capacity to learn and perhaps behave well in class. And the other graphic is from Jack Shankoff from the Harvard Center for the Developing Child. And I like this because it kind of shows that we need a very holistic systems approach to this. What if our policies around education prioritized love and safety rather than the core curriculum? What difference might that make for all children? If we were, am I breaking up?
No, we're just not seeing your graphics. The presentation isn't moving on our end.
Oh, right. So you're not on the science-based, or you're not on the empathetic witness one? No.
No, we're still on your first one. I'd say it's just locked in.
Okay, I'll just get rid of them. So because I think it's to do with my bandwidth.
Thanks, Jane.
So I'll just look at them myself, and I won't say too much about them because you'll only be annoyed. But I can always
send
share
them out
them
afterwards. Yeah,
I can certainly do that. That's no problem at all. So there's a study as well that I'd like to mention by Arnold Samarov and some colleagues that studied the links between risk accumulation and intellectual development. And they examined risk factors like poverty, having an unemployed head of household, low maternal education attainment, maternal mental illness, maternal anxiety, paternal absence, minority group status, and then stressful life events like a job loss, illness, or death in the family, and large family size. And what they found was fascinating. So this study involved 4-year-old children, and in the absence of any risk factors, the average verbal IQ score among the 4-year-olds was 119. With one risk factor, the average score was 116, and with 2 risk factors, it was 113. But with 4 risk factors, the IQ score reduced to 93. And this is the real startling statistic. An accumulation of 8 risk factors resulted in an IQ score of 85. So that's a substantial reduction in verbal IQ, linked to the accumulation of stress within the family and wider social circumstances. And James Gabarino and Robert Haslam associate verbal IQ with aggression and violence. And in interpreting Samarov's findings, they say that if we put too many burdens on a kid's shoulders, he can't stand up under the weight. There's only so much that any of us can tolerate and bear without it taking a toll somehow. And this toll can be taken on our capacity to learn and behave well in the classroom. So really, we can actually interpret learning and behavioral problems, at least some of the time, as signals of distress. And instead of viewing challenging behavior as something intrinsic to the child, we should be curious about what might be prompting it, and more compassionate, and do our absolute best as adults to be patient. And I am aware that this can be extremely challenging, either as a parent or a teacher or other staff member in schools, particularly when we don't know about neurodevelopment and ACEs and trauma. Our ability to regulate our own emotions becomes very problematic indeed. But there are links to adverse childhood experience scores and learning and behavioral problems. So children who had 4 or more adverse childhood experiences were far more likely to have learning and behavioral problems, such as ADHD or opposition defiance disorder. And there's an interesting article on one of my slides about how the Education Secretary in the UK had stated just last week that 40% of education inequality is baked in by the age of 5. And in that piece, or it was actually on LinkedIn, that a chap from the Wave Trust was saying, in fact, actually, policymakers almost believe that children are born at the age of 5 in terms of how they set up the education system and supports. So they were calling for greater investment in early years services and proper funding for early years workers, because they have a key role to play. But learning and behavioural problems as well are hugely linked to school exclusion. And a study from 2012 by Williams for the UK Ministry of Justice on prisoners' childhood and family backgrounds found that 59% had regularly truanted from school, so they'd gone on the hop. 63% had been temporarily excluded from school, so suspended temporarily, and 42% of all offenders had been permanently excluded, so they'd been expelled. And from my own research, an awful lot of the men in my PhD study had left school early, and many of them ended up in the likes of Oberstown or Trinity House and places before that, or St. Patrick's institution, and their educational attainment was severely arrested. But also in my current study with REP in UL, is finding that early school leaving is a feature of many of the young people's lives who get involved in gangs. And one Garda who I interviewed as part of the network analysis mentioned a young person who was in his mid-teens who he asked, "Why are you not at school?" And the boy said, "My teacher told me I was thick and there was no point in me being there." And this is, 2020, 2021 that this type of talk is going on. It's abusive language to use to any child. And of course, if they already have an internal working model that is negative, that they don't have value and worth, then having an authority figure say something so cruel and hurtful, probably from a place of anger due to perhaps something that the young person had done, but that's not good enough, because we do need to, as adults in positions of authority, learn to regulate our own emotions. We can't kind of fight fire with fire and expect a good outcome. So there's a phrase that a dysregulated adult cannot regulate a dysregulated child. We need, as adults, to try and stay in our cortical thinking brain. There's a nice hand model of the brain actually that Dan Siegel has. Down here is our brain stem, our survival brain. In here is the limbic system, the attachment brain, and this is our cortical thinking brain. And if we flip our lids, so if we get agitated or feel unsafe or feel emotionally threatened somehow, we will flip our lid. And that means we're not rational, we're not accessible to new knowledge, and we're not capable of relating well to others. Well, adults, so teachers in a classroom, need to try and stay in their cortex, even when the children or young people in front of them have flipped their lids. If both individuals flip their lids, then it's a kind of a recipe for disaster. Nadine Burke-Harris and the Center for Youth Wellness in California found that children with 4 or more adverse childhood experiences are 32 times more likely to have learning and behavioural problems. So again, ADHD or oppositional defiance disorder and that type of thing, than children who have no ACEs. And she has said, now Burke-Harris is the Surgeon General of California now, she has said that the number 1 treatment is to reduce the dose of adversity. Number 2, to enhance the capacity of the caregivers in the child's life to be a buffer to their stress. So that really also, I think, includes teachers, because teachers have a key role to play in the well-being of children. They do really matter. They're key relationships in every child's life, and they can be relationships that are really positive and buffering, or that are undermining and toxic and harmful. Where a child is exhibiting challenging behaviours, if meds are necessary, blood pressure medication works to address the impaired stress response system. So we needn't be pathologizing all children as we currently might be, and reaching for the prescription pad for ADHD medication, a lot of the science is showing that it's the dysregulation of the stress response system that is causing many of the symptoms, including impulsivity and hypervigilance and that type of thing. So blood pressure medication might work just as nicely. The other thing is not behaving well in school, and this is a quote from Longy and Brown, who did a study in 2017. Not behaving well in school when in fight, flight or fright mode is not a choice for high ACE students. The reaction is not a cognitive one. It is hardwired, instinctual for survival. Not engaging in learning is not a choice either. We think we have safe classrooms, but the threat, hyperarousal, vigilance, etc., that their brain state creates suggests unsafe conditions that we cannot see. And I think that is a really great point. We cannot presume that our classrooms feel safe for all children. They don't. And there's a lovely video that some of you might have seen, or movie called Paper Tigers, about a trauma-informed secondary school. It was an alternative high school. I also interviewed Jim Sporleder, who led the trauma-informed change there, and they deliberately tried to foster safety and be loving to all the children, irrespective of how dislikable they could be at times, trying to push people away and get the same rejecting responses that they'd got from pretty much all the adults in their lives up until that point. There's also a tremendous video that I recommend that you watch on state-dependent functioning by Bruce Perry, that basically shows that our IQ goes down when we're alarmed, but it goes down substantially when we're afraid. So when we're calm and in our neocortex, our IQ is between 100 and 120. If we're alarmed, our IQ goes down to 60 to 90. And when we're overwhelmed with fear and in our brainstem, in our survival state, our IQ drops to between 50 and 70. And that is for all of us. That is not just traumatized children or adults. That is absolutely all of us. And I'd like you to think about some time when you were very afraid and how rational you were, how well you were able to hear what was going on around you, and how well you were able maybe to process speech and plan in a good way. I guarantee you there were a few times that I can recall where I was definitely in such an agitated condition that I wasn't my best self or my most rational self. So this is just a feature of being a mammal with a nervous system, and the fact that when we're attuned to threat and danger, our goal as mammals is to survive that threat and danger, not to be intellectuals or not to be focused on reading from the textbook or computing our maths problems. The stress response continuum is really something that all teachers, and I think all of us, need to understand. And we mentioned earlier the fight, flight and freeze response, but there are actually other responses as well. The flop state or the collapse state, that is the essence of trauma. And when children cannot escape their unsafe environment, particularly if they're subject to abuse or neglect in the family home, they will likely develop a tendency to dissociate and disconnect from their environment in order to survive. So their brains and bodies will kind of disconnect in order to remain connected to their caregivers, who might be frightening and frightened, or just very emotionally unstable. And so if you dissociate enough, that'll become maybe your pattern in life. And while it's a very good adaptive strategy to escape life threat, it can be difficult to really then apply yourself again in the classroom. The other thing is, if you're hypervigilant and highly aroused, you're likely to be impulsive and maybe, have a very small window of tolerance, which might mean that you will explode at the smallest provocation. And this would be something that young boys and men might exhibit more, although of course girls and women can also be hypervigilant and maybe have an explosive fuse. Or we might even vacillate between hypoarousal and dissociation. and it might not remember certain things. Indeed, I've spoken to people with trauma histories who can't remember several years of their childhood or teenage years. So if that's the case, if they're in that type of dissociative condition for long enough, it's highly unlikely they'll be able to apply themselves to learning in the way that they might if they were actually safe. The other response to draw your attention to, and I must finish up now soon, is the fawn response, which is about people pleasing. And this is being highly attuned to the emotional states of others and trying to please them. Like, we do all need to try and please people sometimes, but we also need to have boundaries and to know that we matter regardless of whether we please everyone all the time or not. And so some children in classrooms might actually be quite popular with their teachers because they're very nice and visible, but perhaps that actually is also a symptom of trauma, but it's more one of the pleasant symptoms if you're trying to manage a classroom of lots of different types of personalities. But many people who are trauma survivors will describe themselves as people pleasers, unable to say no, unable to prioritize their own interests. And we do need a balance. You know, we need to be considerate of others in order to become successful humans and manage to, I suppose, have healthy families and contribute to the workplace and all of that. But we do also need to sometimes put ourselves first and prioritize our own well-being. It's not selfish, it's actually very necessary. So I'm going to finish up now, but I'd just like to say that some kids in our classrooms in Ireland and in every country in the world are actually living with a kind of Godzilla figure rampaging around their insides. They're in chronic stress, and their life-preserving brain has been overdeveloped. And so neutral cues might look threatening to some children. Other children will be anxious, disengaged, and poor learners, but they might not have behavioral problems, but they're sitting there blank-faced and they're not learning anything. And really, all schools, in order to serve children, need to be ACE aware, trauma informed, and understand basic brain development and the nervous system in order to be able to help children to really have any prospect of reaching their full potential. Because it's not good enough for children to end up in prison where they can then finally learn in a prison school because they feel safe enough there, but in their childhood all the signs have been missed that they're in a chronic state of stress and have a fixed allostatic load, which is to do with the surging cortisol that just never goes away. And that the adults in our classrooms do not have the faintest idea that these are not bold children. These are children who are just chronically stressed and need to feel safe and loved and seen and heard. So I'll end it there. Hopefully you actually understood what I was saying, and